welcome back to another episode of Perpetually Patek. Today I'm joined by Tim Mosso, and today we are going to be speaking about our top 10 favorite discontinued Patek Philippe watches. Tim, why don't you take us through your first pick?
Now here's the thing, people know me pretty well, they understand I'm a Complications fan, so I'm going to come out of the gate with something they don't expect. I absolutely adored the old Reference 6000. Came out in 2005 with a black dial before it was sort of rebooted in 2008 with a gray dial, and I think that's where it really found its stride. Now, it's not a huge piece, and it is an evolution of the 5000 that came out in 1992. That was an interesting piece because of its off-center seconds, small seconds, very strong lug profiles. So even though the original was very small, it wore large, and even though the 5000 was a 33, it was more like a 35, 36 millimeter watch. So with the 6000, we've got something that's 37, but whereas really more like 39. So it has a fantastic sense of proportion in that we don't see this much anymore. If you make a smaller case, you can build out larger lugs because you still get the same fit. So you have a watch that has this unrivaled presence on the wrist for a 37, has a very distinctive dial that I always thought looked as though it were sort of, I guess, co-opted from automotive dashboard instruments, the 1950s, Porsche, Jaguar, Mercedes-Benz. It always had a very automotive feel to me. And that's why I love every version of the 6000, plus the fact that unlike most automatic Calatravas, it got the micro rotor 240 rather than some sort of 315 or 324 center rotor, which makes it slimmer. Like I said, this watch is all about proportions.
And I think you mentioned that there was automotive inspiration, which I think that is a facet of the watch that a lot of collectors aren't aware of, and you particularly see it on the 5000 relative to the 6000. Big fan of the watch. We've mentioned it on shows previously. Really, in terms of how it was almost ahead of its time in being a contemporary dress watch. The final version of the watch was done in blue, which is a particular favorite of mine.
And also, the main difference, if you ask most people, between a 5000 and a 6000, it's not going to be a few millimeters of case size. It's going to be that lunette radial style date, which is just, it's the icing on the cake for this piece. It has always been one of my Patek Philippe hero watches, and frankly, probably the least expensive one on my list today. Maybe the least expensive on either of our lists today.
Yeah, no, and I think that the utilization of that for the date is something that I wish I had seen more in other collections, but that we do get to see it in the current version of the World Time, the 5330.
Very much. So where do you stand on this?
So where do I stand on the 6000 or my first pick?
No, it's about you now. What's your first pick?
Okay, so I am going to start with a bang. The 3974 in platinum. So this is a minute repeater, perpetual calendar, automatic minute repeater that was launched in 1989 for the 150th anniversary. And what is special about this watch is that it was the first time that Patek Philippe had done an automatic minute repeater perpetual. So that's the first thing, utilizing a micro rotor. The second is the fact that the watch is 36 millimeters and very thin. And so for me, the size and proportions of the watch are absolutely perfect. And then lastly, the cases for these watches were designed by Jean-Pierre Hagman, who is one of the most storied case designers in Patek Philippe history. And so the combination of all these things, for me, it's like that grail repeater that just sits in my top 5 list.
So now, you've probably realized by this point that these are in no particular order because it's very difficult to rank favorites. It's like your children. You don't want to play favorites. But since he just came out swinging with a monster Complication, I'm going to come out swinging with one of my own. I adore the 1993 to 2011 5016. Another watch that is just the epitome of elegance and taste. 36.2 millimeters. Again, we have a Jean-Pierre Hagman case with his distinctive recessed repeater slide track. That was one of his sort of original innovations and contributions to the art. But now we have a watch that's a retrograde perpetual calendar, a case-back tourbillon, a certified chronometer, it's a minute repeater, and anyone who's flipped one of these over realizes that that ridiculous 5-spoke polished gold third wheel is where the action happens. The tourbillon is not the star. It's that enormous octopus-like third wheel. It takes somewhere around 10, 11 hours just to finish that one part. and then you have the Tourbillon, and then you have the Mint Repeater, and then you have the retrograde perpetual calendar. They made it from 93 to about 2011, but the best estimate is that there's probably only around 200 of them in the world. And normally, I'm a real partisan of dark dials and white metal cases. But I almost feel that with the 5016, every 5016 is the ultimate 5016. I would happily wear any of them. And the one that actually captured my heart back in the waning days of Watch You Want, it was a beautiful black lacquer dial with rose gold, and it just clicked gorgeous for me. I will never forget that watch.
Fantastic watch, great size. And again, this is one of those references that I feel like you don't really appreciate it until it's gone.
The other thing too is there was, and this is something we have to recognize in Patek history, but that late Henri Stern into Philippe Stern era, late 80s into early 90s, is when Patek Philippe became the complications powerhouse we know today. Yes, traditionally there had been some world times, some minute repeaters, some split-second chronographs, and perpetual calendars. But these monster complications where you had 2, 3, or more all in one case, that's really a modern creation, and it did sort of arise with the elevation of Philippe Stern from his father's understudy into the chief of the company. And I think that's really part of his legacy, this era that we're highlighting now.
No, I mean, Patek emerged in the late 80s, especially in 1989 for their anniversary, really as the preeminent complications master, particularly the minute repeater. And it was a know-how that they kept the production going even during the quartz crisis. And I think that, as you mentioned, really carried them through into the 90s and the advent of all these bigger complications.
And it did change our perception of the companies. You know, you talk about the 3974, talk about the 5016. Prior to 1990, if you were looking to buy a Chiming watch, the company that made the most of them was Gerald Genta. After 1990, if you wanted to buy one and put your name on it, Christophe Claret. But if you wanted to buy one that was its own thing under its own name, the maker's mark was going to be Patek Philippe. From 1990 forward, they really accelerated and never looked back.
Yeah. So it looks like it's my turn.
We're up to number 2.
Okay. So for me, and I guess we're doing 5 each, right? So for me, though, any top 5 has to include a world time. It's a complication that they're known for. It's a complication that they've, I would say, patented the most easy to use world time complications. And so I did a lot of thinking, and I have, call it my pick, and then what could very well be my pick, but it doesn't exist yet.
Okay.
Or does exist, because I don't know if it's coming or not coming.
No insider information will be shared here.
So it would be the 5575G. So that is the 175th anniversary world time limited edition. The watch was produced in white gold. It was the first time and only time that this particular case had been used. And it was the first and only time outside of the ladies variation that had been made for the same launch that Patek had done a world time with a moon phase. And for me, it just checked every box. It had a modern design interpretation, an interesting case shape, white metal, black dial, the way that they integrated the moon phase onto the center of the dial.
And with the black dial, the moon phase, it blends in. It seems almost grander than just a small disc. It seems like it envelops the dial.
Exactly. It just feels like it's a part of the essence of the watch, that the watch itself was designed around the moon phase, as opposed to it just being an added-on complication or an afterthought. And so for me, just a perfectly executed watch and one of my top picks. For what doesn't exist, but I would love, so I am a big fan of the 5131 Rose, which is the Cloisonné Center rose gold world time. However, I love the case on the discontinued 5230, and they never did produce a 5231 in rose, only the white gold, which is still in production, and only the yellow gold. And so for me, a rose gold variation with that particular map would just be flawless.
And then we were talking about this before we shot, and I was saying, never say never. This could be something that gets unearthed at, say, the Rome exhibition in the year 2033 or something like this. Every once in a while, Patek brings back an older reference for one of its localized exhibitions. The best example of that would be the Saatchi Gallery in London, where they brought back all of the old classics for 5, maybe 10-piece limited editions. So again, never say never.
Yeah. In the past, one would have assumed that it would have been the next watch to come, right? Sort of that would have followed Patek tradition. But now we have in the collection the 5231G, but we also have the new 5330G World Time. So you have what is really the next evolution of the World Time model. And so, again, it's anybody's guess what's going to come out.
I think that's a really cool piece. And if we're talking about things that don't exist, I would like to have a Pennsylvania state lottery win so I can buy a 5016. Okay, so now we're going to talk about something that is near and dear to my heart. We're going to go back to that 175th anniversary, the Platinum 5975P. Now this is the triple scale flyback chronograph. This is a watch that's notable because it has only a 60-second chronograph scale, but you've got your choice of a tachymeter, a pulsometer, or a telemeter. It is beautiful, and while the 3 golds were made in 400 pieces each, the Platinum model was only made in 100, and it really does seem that special. It's a 40mm watch, but because of the strength of the faceted bezel, the stepped lugs, it seems bigger. And one common feature to many of these anniversary pieces is that they were solid casebacks. They were commemorative casebacks, but they also had commemorative clasps. So a lot of people struggle to make their peace with these solid caseback watches, and I just have to remind folks, that's what makes it special. Every once in a while, it's understood that if you want to do something really exclusive in the modern era, you give the person that much more platinum or that much more gold. You preserve the precious metal integrity of the piece, and then you put a dedication on the back. The new Daniel Roth subscription Tourbillon did that. Solid case back on the subscription series. Sapphire displays afterward. And this is how Patek designed the 175 series watches. So these are all about the dials. If it's something like the moon phase world time or the triple scale chronograph, all the heat is on the top side of the stove, and that makes sense. But it is a flyback chrono. It's very useful if you need to time things that occur in rapid succession, and it is a beautiful and nostalgic look at the kind of chronographs, multi-scale chronographs that would have been made in the first half of the 20th century by Patek Philippe. I adore that watch and everything about it. Remember, you can't wear them upside down. May as well be dial side fun.
No, and so one other fact was that the 5975P was only available at the salon. So whereas the other 3 variations, white gold, rose gold, yellow gold, which all had the same dial color, were available while limited globally. And what's interesting is when you have the opportunity to see those watches in the flesh, the dials all take on a sort of a different color based on the tone of the metal. And so the white gold version looks and feels differently than the rose gold version, even though the dials are the same.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. You can never separate a watch into its parts. It's the total. It's the sum.
Yeah.
And that's a watch that just feels steely and cool, like something you'd wear in London, Chicago, or New York. It's not a Miami watch.
So taking like a left turn now, I'm going to pick a sportier watch, one that was recently discontinued, and it's perhaps my favorite of the Aquanauts. I don't have one. I actually wear a different Aquanaut. I'm wearing a 5065 right now. So for like almost daily wear, this watch I love, both for fit, feel, and size. But my pick would be the 5164A. And the reason being is that from just a utility, size, aesthetic perspective, I think it's perfect. It's easy to use. You have the GMT functionality whenever you would want to use it based on the buttons on the case side. I'm not the biggest fan of GMT hands when they're there on the dial. I love that you can set the local time in front of the home time, and it's just a perfectly executed, great size watch, and I was very sad to see it go in stainless steel.
Yeah, that is a fine piece, and I think it was probably the model that gave that line a distinct identity to celebrate it and also separate it from its bigger and older brother. I think going with the travel time when there was no direct Nautilus equivalent back in 2011 really helped create a little bit of a gap between the Aquanaut and the Nautilus. And of course, a travel time chronograph eventually emerged in 2014, but it's not quite the same thing. A travel time in isolation is a very special thing. and it's a watch you can wear anywhere, and it's a watch you do wear anywhere.
Exactly. No, and for me, it's the fact that you can wear anywhere, and that it's light and comfortable. And so my sort of honorable mention pick is the same reference, but in white gold for the advanced research, the 5164G advanced research. And so this watch was a gray blue color scheme, skeletonized dial. I mean, just flawless. And I think that the success of that watch and how well it was executed, I'm sure was partly inspiration for the 5164G that exists today.
So for me, I guess number 4 is going to be something I always loved, because I love perpetual calendars. I love calendars in general. But while I adore the 5236, I get the feeling that it might just be a little bit too large for me. And being a platinum watch, all the more so. I adore the 5235G. Now, this is a very ambitious watch, not technically part of the advanced research series. Nevertheless, when it came out in 2011, it leveraged a lot of that learning. You had the full silicon escapement, you had the silicon hairspring, you had a new generation micro rotor movement that owes nothing to the prior 240. It was bigger, it was broader, it filled the case back of a 40.5mm watch. Plus, we got the lovely resurrection of the 3448 case shape with its angular bezel and its it's projecting, thrusting, angular lugs, almost Carrera-like, to be honest. It's a very cool look. It's a very severe looking watch outside. Then you get to the dial and all is order, because it's a regulator. And it's very subtle, because unlike most Patek references, which have some sort of transferred logo, the logo on this one is engraved and it's not inked. So it's super subtle on a stainless steel like vertical curtain of brushed metal. The regulator dial, I'm not gonna lie, it is a little bit of a challenge to read. That's sort of where something like the new salmon dial 5236 really comes in for me from a legibility standpoint. But the 5235G is something that I could, in good conscience, take that extra moment to acknowledge. Yes, it takes a bit more energy to read, but the calendar system is that much easier to acknowledge because it's an all-aperture design. And having an annual calendar on a Patek Philippe, this is something that's theirs. They invented that in 1996. So you combine that distinctive heritage-inspired case, a good size, a cool, larger, brand new movement, advanced technology, an easy-to-read calendar. And if nothing else, the regulator is the kind of thing that sets this watch apart aesthetically. Plus, it was one of the first modern Pateks to have a hacking seconds feature, so you truly can regulate it to the second. I adore that watch.
And it was one of the first watches that really, it launched to a lot of fanfare, right? There was a lot of excitement around the model. A few of them were delivered, and then the watch actually disappeared for quite a while. And so collectors didn't really know, was this just going to be a short production run? Was this a one-year watch? And then the watch started delivering again, and then we see it today, obviously, in the rose gold variation.
Yeah, I think the dream of silicon was that it would make things really easy. I think the reality of silicon is that we're talking a whole realm of physics where watchmakers had hitherto not probed.
Right.
So it was very advanced, came out in 2011. There weren't a whole lot of deliveries until 2 years after that. There were some fits and starts in production, with the result that even though it was technically made from 2011 to 2019 in white gold, there's not a lot of them out there. No. It's not a numerous or common watch. It always draws admiration, but I like the fact that it's a little bit under the radar. It's still very special. I know Terry Stern has said it's one of his personal favorites from his era at the fore of the company. And down to the last details, like the buckle, the pin buckle on that watch with the vintage style Patek logo,
fantastic.
Even that is unique to the model. So just an awesome top to bottom effort. I love that watch.
I have that buckle in my 5970. I thought it was, I'm a Tang buckle person, and that was the buckle to have.
I can endorse that.
Yeah. Moving right along, I think I'm on number 4 now. Is that right?
I want to say that you're leading, so I just did number 4, so you must be on number 5.
I don't know, but okay, I'm
bonus innings.
There may be a bonus here. Okay, so my next pick, I'm a sucker for case shapes, for shaped cases, and I think that as far as Patek goes, they've done it all. Right, you have the ellipse, you have the gondolo, but you don't really have anything really crazy in the current collection. And so a selection of watches that I've always been fascinated with, I've never had one myself, but it's one of those things that I praise it from afar, are the Gilbert Albert asymmetry cases, particularly the 3413. And I love these watches. I just think that they're super interesting. They're unique. I love the design ethos from this time period. And they are just a selection of watches that if I could close my eyes and bring something back, these would be some of the watches that I would bring back.
And not just that, but his extraordinary fame was such that even in period, his contributions were acknowledged. You know, you look at Gerald Genta, and brands weren't launching watches presented by Gerald Genta.
Correct.
In the late 50s, early 60s. Whereas with Albert, immediately billing was attributed. This was a designer who was featured. It was a name that even Patek Philippe felt comfortable pushing to the fore. And that just speaks to the fame and renown he had at the peak of his career. There are a lot of Genta watches from that period that are not attributed. The fact that Albert, even in the, I guess, purple patch of his prime, was always acknowledged speaks to just what a special artist he was and how highly Patek and others regarded him, even at the time.
Correct.
A lot of stuff has to be done retroactively. You find out that Gerald Genta designed the Nautilus. You find out that Jörg Heissig designed the 222. But Albert was considered to be a master in his moment, which is a very rare thing for an artist to be fully acknowledged during his lifetime and during his prime.
And I appreciate that it wasn't just one watch, right? It was a series of watches, objects, pocket watches, right? It was really like an entire design ethos that took over the models from that particular year or time period. And so I've always been fascinated by them. I love the aesthetic. I think it's, if you're not studying those watches from the past, you wouldn't even believe that they had been created. But here they are.
That's true. A designer could credibly take all of those Albert watches, bring them to his shop foreman and say, these are the 2024 models. And the answer would be, oh, yeah, of course.
Yeah.
There's nothing dated about them. They haven't gathered any moss. They are incredibly forward-looking. I think the only thing that marks them as products of their time is when you have one in person, they're a little bit smaller than you'd expect.
Yeah.
But multiply by like 1.4 and you've got a very modern watch that have really stood the test of time. Okay, so I'm going to discuss a form watch as well. This is not, I guess, technically a highly complicated watch, but the 5101 in platinum, salmon dial. Back when Patek Philippe still participated in the GPHG, this was a laureate, and this is one of the great Patek Philippe watches of all time, reaching back into the Art Deco era and bringing back this lovely, multiply straked tonneau form in platinum, salmon dial, 10-day power reserve, Geneva hallmark and a chronometer certificate with a tourbillon. This is as good gets. Now, it looks huge in pictures, but it doesn't wear that way. And this is a landmark piece for Patek Philippe. Whenever you have a 5101 in any metal, it is the capstone of a collection. It's the thing you want on the front page of your website. It's the thing you want on your wrist when you're among the most sophisticated collectors. It's always in good taste. It's not bombastic in any way, in spite of its rarity and its expense. And bonus points, Recep Recepi, who interned at Patek Philippe, he actually said that the watch that inspired his sensibility and ethic of design and quality more than any was the 5101. And
really?
I can't think of a higher endorsement
That's a
than
big
that.
praise.
Yeah, well, I mean, he could afford one now. But back in the day, it was sort of like the root of what he believed in terms of how a watch should be turned out. It should be beautiful. It should be perfect. It should be monumental without being monumentally huge. And you could see it in the work he does today. It doesn't look like Patek, but the standard is there.
Yeah. So I still am racking my brain if I did 4 or 5. But so I'm going to do an honorable mention then.
Okay.
And so any top 10 collection really should have a Nautilus somewhere in there, right? I just think for me, it's probably the, if an Aquanaut is like the sporty watch, this is the integrated bracelet modern day steel sports watch, right? So of all of the ones from the past that I most gravitate towards, it's probably the 5711 with the olive green dial. To me, it's one of the most beautiful executions of the watch that's been done. Right? I think that the olive itself is very subtle. It depends on what light you're viewing the watch in. The color is perfect. And for me, the size of the 5711 was just perfect from its inception. If I had to say my inside baseball Nautilus pick, it would be a 3711 1G. So
yes.
This watch came out after the 3700, before the 5711. It is entirely in white gold. It features a 2-part case and it has a black dial. It is the only, I would say, of the modern day time-only Nautilus, is the only one that has a black dial. It actually is slightly larger. It's a jumbo size, slightly larger in fit and feel than the 5711, but the bracelet is definitely thinner. And so for me, it's just a spectacular watch. Not very many were made. It was a very short production run. And so if you're interested in seeing a special Nautilus, check out the 3711 1G.
Yeah, that's the key thing. It was only available in white gold, I want to say 2004 to early 2006. A low take rate. It is a bigger watch and it is a flatter watch, and it's a traditional case construction versus the 3-piece 5711. So this really was sort of a run-up to test the waters for a running center-second Nautilus. And it's a beautiful piece. It's a rare piece. I don't know whether you can definitively say whether there are more 3711 1Gs or 3712s in the world, but that's an awesome pair to have. If you've got one, you're balling. If you've got both, you're the man. Those are definitely collectible Nautilus models. I'm going to throw one in there too, because I haven't really talked about sports watches, and like you said, you should have one. So I'm going to go with the 1998 3710.
Okay.
A quirky watch.
The Comet.
Yes. The dial is a little bit unusual with the numerals present. It's got an unusual power reserve, only ever used on that model. It holds the distinction of being the first ever complicated Nautilus that had something more than a date. And the power reserve is interesting because you have both an index and a disc moving at the same time. So it never looks the same 2 times. It's sort of rotating, it's sort of orbiting itself. It's a very difficult thing to read if you're not familiar with the watch, but it is very, very cool. And it's built on top of the 330 automatic. I think it's a 330 SC IZR is technically what this is called. So based on that power reserve, on that movement base, this is a unique caliber in a unique model. It'll always be important because it was the first complicated Nautilus, and it'll always be rare because it was very expensive and people didn't buy many of them. So for me, I think that would be my sports watch. I'm not going to go with the obvious steel 5961A with a black dial, because everyone knows that and I talk about it all the time.
It's a great one too.
It is a great one. Get that. If you can get that, get that.
But I feel like for the 3710 is one of those watches where I almost think collectors either love it or don't like it at all. Right, like it's
polarizing.
I think, yeah, it's definitely polarizing. Like the juxtaposition of a sportier watch with the Roman numerals. I think it's like the collectors that have it and enjoy it, they love the watch, and then there are others that, for whatever reason, it's like a classic dial. It's like a classic dial on a sporty watch. So it's definitely a polarizing piece.
Yeah, it's got a steady and strong market, but the market's nothing like a 3712, and I love that piece. I guess maybe I'm just a bit of an iconoclast when it comes to the Nautilus.
You're always against the grain.
It doesn't haunt my dreams, but the 3710, it's like me. It's not quite right, but it works. So how about another bonus inning? I know there's a minute repeater with a world time that you happen to love.
So I love the minute repeater Complication from Patek because I think that they do it, bar none, by far and away the best in the world. And I love their world time Complication, and I am a sucker for their rare handcrafts. And so there is one watch that combines all 3 of them, and that is the 5531. And so they recently discontinued, I want to say a year or so back, the 5531 in rose, which was the world time minute repeater with the cloisonné center. And for me, that watch was just a masterpiece. And so it's one of those watches that encapsulates everything that I love about the brand in one piece. And when I talk about a grail, to me, that's like, one of the tops of the list.
And I remember at an event that exhausted superlatives, the New York exhibition back in 2017, that's where they unveiled this. It was rife with new patents. It was a world time and a minute repeater. It featured an artisanal treatment to the New York skyline. It was very rare, very expensive, and it has the ability to adjust the repetition system based on how you change your city of reference.
Exactly.
And it's not huge. That's the other thing. If another company were to make something like this, it might be technically proficient, but it would also be gigantic. This is remarkably compact for what it is. Like most Patek complications, it's an incredible feat of packaging.
And it sounds amazing too, you know, so I think that it really does, for me, embody like the essence of the brand. And so if a client or a collector was looking to target just, you know, one watch that just checks every box, this watch checks every box.
I got one more watch since we're doing extra innings here. We're playing some overtime. A watch I've only seen sealed in plastic. We had it once, I couldn't review it, I couldn't wear it. The 5275, we keep coming back to that 175th anniversary. That was a really good year back in 2014. This was a watch made in 175 pieces. So for something like this, it's not super rare, but in platinum at about 47 millimeters lug to lug, just under 40 side to side, tonneau case, another form watch, fully engraved case, fully engraved dial.
Jump hour.
And not just a jump hour, jumping hours, minutes, and seconds. Multiple patents received, and an hour striker too. There's nothing else like this out there. If you take the Journe Vagabondage series collectively, you get all these features except the strike. But all of these things in one case, and it's not the size of a roofing shingle, it was an incredible achievement and a supremely beautiful feat of craft art. You think about engraving a platinum case, you get one shot at that. You make a mistake, you're cooked. I mean, maybe if you're the chief engraver at Patek, you can burn one match. But
Not something I'd want to scratch.
You don't get a whole lot of shots at doing this right. You got to get it right 175 times. And so no two of them are exactly alike, but a very special watch and super low key. It's not a hype watch, it's not a sports watch, it's not an obvious watch. And although you wear it on your sleeve in a literal sense, it's also a little bit undercover.
Yeah, no, and I love a jump hour. I mean, for me, that is a complication that I wish existed in the collection in some way. I think that the gondola shape is perfect for it, and I mean, these are like the little, like these are the gems that exist within the history of Patek that if you're focused on the modern that you may not even be aware of, that you just can't even believe all the different things that they've done over time and that they have the capability of doing.
Yeah, and that is part of the fun. There is such a back catalog, and you can go all the way back to pocket watches. And just this year, 2024, they restated their commitment to providing parts and service for any watch made back to the Patek and Chopek era in 1839. And that's why whenever people say, oh, you know, I don't know how I feel about Patek, I'm like, well, then you have to learn more. Because eventually you're going to find something you love. This is not some 20-year-old independent brand where you can learn pretty much the entire production history in a weekend. This is an ongoing journey of discovery, and even you and I, if we were to really dig deep into the archives in Geneva, we'd probably find enough watches that we love to film 5 or 6 of these shows.
Yeah.
So it's not just a hobby, it's a journey of discovery, and I think it's always important to take a purchase and turn it into an experience. With Patek Philippe, learning is the experience.
Thank you everybody for tuning in. If you've watched the entirety of this episode and you're here at the very end, our next Perpetually Patek is going to be on the case for small watches. And so if there's anything that you're interested in learning about or any particular references that you'd like us to talk about, mention it in the comments.
I'm crushing your head.
What's that?
I'm just kidding you. I'm just kidding you.